Well, good morning. I am excited to be starting a new sermon series with you this morning, and when I was praying about what would be our next series, this is what kept coming back to me, and I prayed about it for a long time. I wasn't set on it, but I really felt led to go with God in our church on a journey through a season of prayer. And it just so happens that I've been inviting you to neighborhood meetings that start this week. And this is the week the sermon series starts. And my belief is that if we will truly humble ourselves and pray and seek the will of God and the face of God together as a church, that as we have these meetings, God will birth things out of them that we will be able to one day point back and say, that was the moment. That was the moment revival began at Robertsdale UMC. That was the moment new visions and new dreams began to happen at Robertsdale UMC because God planted those there. So we're going to be talking about what it means to be a circle maker. The sermon series that we're starting today is based on a book written by a pastor named Mark Batterson in Washington, D.C. He wrote the book some years back, and over the past several years, this idea, this story, and these biblical ideas have been changing people and churches all over. And so we have these books available. You're welcome to get one and read through it with us as we journey through the series. We have a Wednesday night Bible study that started this series last Wednesday, but you can come anytime. It's always an open door Wednesday night Bible study after the fellowship dinner. And I started handing out books on Wednesday, and we ask for $10 donation if you can. We appreciate that because it just helps the church recover the cost of the books, $10 per book. But as of Wednesday, we only had like 3 or 4 books left. So I put them in the connection cove at the welcome desk, and I ordered more, and they were supposed to be here yesterday, but they got delayed by weather. So they will be here, hopefully by this Wednesday night, but you're welcome to get this. You can get it on Amazon or a Christian bookstore of any kind. But Mark Batterson calls it the circle maker because it's based on a particular story about a particular man. In the 1st century BC, the 1st century before Jesus, the Israelites were going through a significant period because they had been in a drought for over a year. Now, if any of you have any kind of agricultural background or you've just lived in Robertsdale for any length of time, you know what it would be like if you can just imagine no rain at all for over a year. How that would devastate communities, families, how it would devastate the economy. This was their situation. And on top of this, that was their immediate circumstance. Their general circumstance was that the last of their prophets, the mouthpieces of God, had died almost 4 centuries before. So they were at least an entire generation or two removed from when the people of God felt like they could hear directly the voice of God. So it was a time when they felt like God was silent, and they were waiting, and they were despairing, and their hope was shrinking. Now, we're Christians, and we know that God eventually broke the silence because he sent a messenger named Gabriel to speak a word to a teenage virgin girl named Mary. And that conversation that broke the silence would forever change the course of history. But these people knew nothing about that conversation. They didn't know it was coming. And so they went to the only man they knew to go to, a man who was a sage who lived on the outskirts, outside the walls of Jerusalem. His name was Honi, or Honi the rainmaker. He was famous because he could actually pray for rain. And the people knew this about him. So they went and they got him. And as Honi made his way toward the outer walls of Jerusalem, the people were gathered there, and he had a 6-foot staff, even taller than the one I'm holding. And without saying anything, Honi simply stuck his staff in the dirt, and he began to draw a circle, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, 360 degrees. And after he drew it, he knelt inside it, lifted his hands to heaven, and prayed, Lord of the universe, I swear by your great name that I will not leave this circle until you show mercy to your people. It was a bold prayer. Such a bold prayer that some thought he was being blasphemous. But as Honi stayed in that circle and prayed to the Lord his God, the unthinkable happened. The first raindrops began to fall. After over a year, because of one bold prayer. The children began dancing in the rain. Parents were catching raindrops in their mouth because they were so parched and dry and thirsty. They were celebrating, but Honi didn't move. With his hands still raised to heaven and his head bowed, he lifted his voice over the shouts of the people and said, "Lord, not for such rain have I prayed, but for the rain that will fill cisterns and caverns and wells." And at that word, such a torrential downpour came that eyewitnesses wrote that the raindrops were larger than eggs. People started to panic because while they loved the rain, it was actually beginning to hurt, and they became fearful of the flash flooding as the dirt turned to mud. And so they sought high ground, and guess what the place was that they sought refuge? The highest place around them, the Temple Mount. They started running up towards the temple in Jerusalem to seek refuge from the rain that Honi had prayed for. But Honi remained in the circle, and he prayed a third time. "Lord, not for such rain have I prayed, but for the rain of your favor and blessing and grace." At this word, the rain changed yet again, and it became a sustaining and steady sun shower that began to soak the earth and refresh the soul, a tangible symbol of God's provision and grace in answer to the prayer of one bold man. Honi took his staff and made his way back to his hovel outside the city. And some of the Sadducees actually tried to have him excommunicated because they said his prayer was too bold. It must be offensive to God that he would demand something with that kind of authority in his voice. But they couldn't do it because no one could repudiate the miracle that happened. Everyone saw it. No one could deny it. And so Honi became one of the most famous prayer warriors in Jewish history. And his story is recorded in the Jewish Book of Legends. And the circle became a symbol because that prayer became one of the most famous prayers in the history of Israel. And it taught the Israelites that God will honor their bold prayers because their bold prayers honor God. Now there's another story that's in our Bible of the people of God making a circle. Do you know what it is? Can you think of a time in the Bible when the people of God made a circle? Jericho. In Joshua chapter 6, long before the story of Honi the circle maker, the Israelites have been wandering in the desert. They've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. They're on the edge of the promised land. God had made a promise to a man named Abraham hundreds of years before this, a promise that Abraham would become a great nation, that his descendants would be led to a land that God would show them and give to them, that this would be a land of promise, a land of plenty, flowing with milk and honey. And guess what? Hundreds of years later, all they've ever known is slavery and not having a home. When was God going to come through on his promise? In the book of Numbers, before we get to Joshua, the first generation of Israelites that were delivered from slavery from Egypt were wandering in the desert, and they saw the promised land. They came up to the edge of it, and they sent spies to check it out. And they came back, and they said, the promised land is filled with people. And not only is it occupied, the people there are giants and they're strong. And so the people of God did what the people of God always tend to do. Instead of praying and walking forward in faith, they cowered in fear. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, and that generation, including Moses, actually was denied being able to go into the promised land. But God raised up a new generation, led by Joshua. And in Joshua 6, we see this new generation also on the edge of the promised land once again. And as they're standing there, they're outside of a city called Jericho. Now, the picture on the screen is a model of what Jericho would have looked like in the location where it actually is today. And Jericho, as you can see, had two walls, an outer wall and an inner wall. It was a 12-acre city surrounded by rock. It was a fortress. The outer wall was 6 feet thick, and the inner wall was 50 feet high. And there was no way the Israelites were going to go in and conquer the city. But in Joshua 6, it said that Jericho was tightly shut because of the children of Israel. Now get this, the children of Israel had been waiting 40 years out of fear because they were scared of Jericho. But Jericho was tightly shut because they heard rumors that there were these wandering sojourners out in the desert, and they were crazy. They had no place to live, and yet they had survived in the wilderness for an entire generation. And when they needed something, God provided it. Their God rained down manna from heaven, bread, every morning. When they were tired of the bread, he sent quail. This God of these strange people must be much more powerful than any of the gods they had known in Jericho. So they were afraid, and they tightly shut their gates. And the Lord came to Joshua and said, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and all its valiant warriors." Now, for you English grammar people, what tense is that? I have given you. Past. They hadn't done anything yet. The walls still stood. Jericho was still inhabited. The people of God are standing outside. What sense does it make for God to say, "I have given you Jericho"? Let me tell you something, child of God. Your future is God's past. Your need is God's provision. And the desire of your heart is what God has already done for you. Even more so for us. Because in Jesus Christ, God has conquered our sin and death problem, the greatest wall of Jericho we could ever have. So all the other walls can come tumbling down. But here's the catch. God says, "I have given you the city of Jericho, but this is what I want you to do. On the first day, I want you to get up, and I want you to go to the priests, and I want you to have 7 priests with 7 ram's horn, called the shofar, going ahead of the Ark of the Covenant." Why? What's the Ark of the Covenant represent? The presence of God. So the priests are to go before the Ark of the Covenant, and the armed men are to go before the priests, and the rear guard is to follow, and the people of Israel are to march around the city of Jericho once, forming a circle around the entire city, circling the territory that God said he already gave them. And the priests are to blow the shofar, but the rest of the Israelites are not to say a word. Why? Because they're not making a statement. God's making a statement. After they are to march around the city of Jericho, they're to go back to camp. They wake up on day 2, assemble the 7 priests with the 7 horns, Ark of the Covenant, armed men in front, rear guard in back, march around the city one time. Same pattern for 6 days. But on the 7th day, they are to march around the city again, but this time they are to do it 7 times. Now, does anybody know what the number 7 represents in the Bible? Completion. The number of totality, the number of completion. God created and then rested. In 7 days, his work was finished. So on the 7th day, they're to march around 7 times, and on the 7th lap, the priests are to let out a long blow on the ram's horn, and when they do, the people of God are to let out the greatest shout they have ever shouted. And when they did, the walls fell. The Israelites took the city and finally got to claim the promise of God from hundreds of years before to Abraham, their forefather, because the promised land was theirs. Here's my question to you today. What is your Jericho? What's your Jericho? If you don't know how to answer that, maybe these 3 questions will help. What promise are you praying around? What miracle are you marching around? And what dream does your life revolve around? If you can answer one of those questions, that's your Jericho. Now here's my problem, and maybe somebody here has this problem too. If I answer one of those questions, I may not hit my Jericho because I like to ignore my Jerichos. My Jerichos are kind of like Jonah's Nineveh. I'm so afraid to bet on God and to walk into what he asked me to do, that sometimes I spend my time and energy focused on something else that's not really my Jericho. So when I ask myself what I'm spending a lot of time and energy worrying about, I have to let God remove that thing first so that I can find what he actually wants me to walk into, his preferred future for my life. So maybe that's you today, but begin to ask yourself, what is my Jericho? I want to tell you about two Jerichos that have existed in our family. The first one was in 2008. My mother-in-law, Liz's mother, Cindy, was diagnosed with acute lymphocytic leukemia. We had been married just over a year. We were in seminary. It was the first time we had ever lived so far away from family. We were about 12 hours from either of our parents. And as that year went on, that following summer, things continued not to look good. And so Liz went down to Slidell, Louisiana, where she's from and her parents were living, and I stayed to finish up school and to, finish my working shift. And I got a call from Liz one morning that said, "I need you here sooner than you were planning." So I went into work and I made arrangements with my boss and kind of got indefinite leave, which was very gracious. I packed 2 months worth of our stuff and our cat into our Honda Civic, and I drove straight to Slidell, Louisiana. And within 2 weeks, her mom was gone. And I remember standing in the bedroom as she was dying, surrounded by family. It was such an incredible moment of grace. And the presence of God in the room was palpable. And yet I remember thinking, how can this be happening? We have prayed fervently for healing. We believed in faith that God was going to heal. There was no lack of faith in the prayer. And yet we're watching her die. How can this be happening? The family comforted each other, and we got on a plane to fly to Virginia for the funeral. And on the plane, I was trying to continue my studies with school. I had a Hebrew grammar book on my lap, and a beloved woman next to me asked me, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a Hebrew grammar book." And she said, "I need to get me one of those." And I said, "I wouldn't recommend it." And we started talking, and I realized that she was a believer. And she asked me who I was, and I explained to her that we were going to bury my mother-in-law. And she had died of cancer. And as innocently as she could, she said, "I'm so sorry, there just must not have been enough faith in the room." And I remember sitting there dumbfounded, because while she meant no offense, I could not believe how hurt and offended. I can still conjure up the emotion that I felt, how unhelpful that was. She explained to me that in her Bible, it says Jesus healed all the people. And that in a prayer that is in faith, healing will always come. I didn't want to argue with her that there are plenty of times in the New Testament where Jesus went on to another town before healing all that were sick there. But I was just so hurt because she was accusing us of lack of faith in one of the most devastating moments of grief I've ever experienced. In the days and weeks that followed, I felt like God was speaking a word through our family. And it was coming around, and different ones of us were hearing it at different times. I heard my father-in-law say it. I heard my wife say it. But the reality is that Cindy had many burdens in her life long before the burden of cancer. We had been praying for her for years, and her family had been praying for her. There were burdens that we didn't know if she would ever live without, that she would ever be rid of in this life. But cancer had been there less than a year, and it was as if the voice of God came in a comforting way and said, "You prayed for healing, and she's healed." Now, it may not be exactly what you prayed for in the way that you wanted, but Cindy is with me today, and she is healed, and her burdens are gone, and her life is at peace. And we were the ones grieving, but Cindy wasn't grieving anymore. Now, I'm not saying that God told me I took Cindy because it was her time and I wanted her. That's not what I'm saying. But the word of comfort that God gave us in that moment, it wasn't an immediate peace, but it slowly began to provide healing and restore our trust in the God that we had been praying to for so long. I have another Jericho that's a little more lighthearted, and it's a Jericho that my son prayed around. Several years ago when he was 4, we were living in the parsonage of Shalimar UMC. Shalimar UMC had two parsonages. One of them was located directly behind the parking lot of the church. We could see out the windows beside our front door every car that came and went in the church parking lot. So guess where people went when they needed a door unlocked at 9 o'clock at night? So our parsonage was two-story. And our son was getting of the age when he could get up out of bed on his own and out of his room, walk down the stairs and come into our room in the morning when he woke up. The problem is my son's always been an early riser. So Noah gets up in the dark. And I didn't realize it, but he was 4 and he was beginning to become afraid of his own house. Because he had to walk out his door, down a double-jointed stairwell, all the way around the stairs, through the bottom of the house, into the back bedroom where Liz and I were. And one night, as we were praying, our family always sang and prayed and read a story. And as we were praying and taking turns, Noah simply prayed, "Lord, I pray that in our next house, we won't have stairs." And you have to understand what that's like for a Methodist pastor to hear when appointment season is approaching. I'm thinking, what new house? So I started wondering if Noah had received a prophetic word that maybe we're moving and we're not going to live in this house next year. So I very prayerfully and carefully entered appointment season. We had our consultations, and strangely, it appeared that we were staying at Shalimar another year. And then we found out the other associate was leaving. And I just kind of sat on it, and I didn't tell anybody. But as I'm picturing their house, I'm realizing that the other parsonage is a little further down from the church, had a massive yard, great for kids and a dog, and it was all one story, same number of bedrooms and everything. But I didn't tell anybody. I just thought, I'm going to see what God does with my son and his. And lo and behold, the pastor and the church administrator and some other folks approached me and said, "By the way, Jonathan, the other associate's leaving, and we wanted to give your family the option to move parsonages. You don't have to. We know you're probably comfortable where you are, but it just seemed courteous to us, since you've been here for 4 years, to give you the option if you'd like." And I said, "Well, come to think of it, we would like to go down and look at it." So we took our kids, we wanted them to see it and feel comfortable with the decision we made. And as we stood in what would be Noah's bedroom, I pointed through the doorway and down the very short hall into the other room, and I said, "Noah, what would that be?" And he smiled from ear to ear, and he said, "Mommy and Daddy's room." If I was standing in Noah's room, I could have thrown a tennis ball to Liz in our room, and she could have caught it without it hitting the floor. It was that close. And I marveled that God would answer the prayer of a 4-year-old in an unthinkable way. I had no idea that any of those circumstances were coming, but I've learned that if I want something bad enough, I need to stop praying for it. And I need to ask Liz or Noah to pray for it, because God listens to them. So here's what I want to challenge you with today. What is your Jericho? Define your dream, claim your promise, spell your miracle. Some of you are not ready to do this, but some of you are. Some of you know what your Jericho is, but you've been putting it off. And we're going to start today a 4-week series of watching God do incredible things with our Jerichos. You're going to see on the altar something new, 3 wreaths, circles. And there are papers already in these circles. We have on the prayer altar papers and pens. The paper's in the shape of a circle. And the first service has already participated, and now I'm inviting you. During the closing hymn, we're going to come to the altar. And those of us who are ready, I challenge you to write down your Jericho today. Write it down and record it. Begin circling it. When you have it written down, you can fold it and just come and put it in the wreath. These wreaths are going to be here all 4 weeks, so we're going to watch these fill up with our prayers, our Jerichos, and we're going to watch what God does during this season as we give these things totally to Him. Instead of fighting our own battles anymore, we're going to start letting the Lord fight our battles, and we're going to watch the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. I'm not going to promise you how soon the Lord's going to answer this or how the Lord's going to answer this. There are some prayers that it may seem like God never answers because His answer was either a no or a not yet or a I had something better. But our job is to circle Jericho, and we're going to begin today. So I invite you during the closing hymn to come up and start giving your Jerichos to the Lord. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you that this story is true. It's not a legend. It's not a fable. There was a time when your people believed the promise that you had already given them their territory. That if they would just be faithful to circle it, Lord, we don't want to stop circling on day 6. We want to be faithful to draw all the circles that you have called us to, and we will pray through until you answer. God, we will give you glory because what we want most is not our desires. What we want most is your will. We thank you for sending your son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross and be buried and be raised from the dead, conquering sin and death, our greatest Jericho. And we know that if you are powerful enough to do that, you are powerful enough to affect any situation that we're praying around, to provide for any need that we have. So, Lord, we want to circle today, and because we recorded it, we will give you all the glory. We will mark the day that we begin praying around these things for your glory and for your praise. In Jesus' name, amen.